My name's Joe Kutner. I work at Heroku, which is a platform as a service for running JHipster apps or any other kind of app. My job there is the Java language owner. So I'm responsible for all the engineering work associated with making sure that the Java platform and all of its frameworks run on our platform. But that also means I contribute to the Java ecosystem to make sure that Hibernate or Spring Boot or whatever it is works on the platform as well, so that developers, when they come to Heroku, don't need to do anything special to use them. So that's how I got started with JHipster. I started getting support tickets for a particular problem with a Spring Boot app that was made with this JHipster thing. This is several years ago. And I kept seeing the same problem over and over and over again. And it turned out after I dug into the JHipster code that it was generating something that didn't work on Heroku. So I contributed, fixed the problem, and fixed it for 1,000 people because I never saw the problem again. So I liked that. It made my job easier. But then I started to get more involved and improved the Heroku generator so that it did more things and better things. And I just keep doing that today. Now at Heroku, we love JHipster for those reasons, of course. But we also love it because it shares one of our values, one of our core values, and that is ephemeralization. So this is a big word. In French, it translates to, well, ephemeralization. It was coined by a guy named Buckminster Fuller in the 1950s. Bucky, as they called him, described this as a characteristic of technology when it's done right, that it should do more and more, or that we should be able to do more and more with less and less until eventually we can do everything with nothing. So the most classic example of ephemeralization is your phone. 10 or 15 years ago, you had a calculator, a notepad, a camera, what else? A compass. But today, all of those things are encapsulated in a single device that's in your pocket, right? So we've reduced what we need to do those things to a single device. Now, everything with nothing sounds somewhat hyperbolic, but if you start to think about the future of the phone, what will it become? Will it be a chip in our brain that we no longer even need a physical device? That's maybe not good, but it's certainly possible, right? And there's other examples of where we can get to that point of not actually having to do anything. So when Bucky would talk about ephemeralization, he would use these parables. So parables are stories that aren't really true, but they convey some kind of meaning. And one of my favorites that I've seen videos of is this story about two societies that lived on either side of a canyon, right? And they wanted to trade goods and services with each other, but they couldn't because of this obstacle. So eventually, they decided just to fill in the canyon with a bunch of rocks. And this allowed them to walk across, trade goods, and just function, right? But they had sort of inadvertently created a dam, which had problems of its own. It blocked the flow of water, which meant their crops weren't getting watered. They could no longer send ships up and down the river. So some brave soul climbed down into this canyon, and he removed a single rock from the bottom of the dam, and this allowed water to flow through. But then as soon as he did that, a rock from above would fall down, right, and just close up the hole again. Eventually, he realized that if he shaped that hole in a particular way, it wouldn't fall. So he had inadvertently discovered the arch. And in this way, water could flow through, but the boat still couldn't fit. So then he realized if they moved that arch up higher, it would have the same function, supporting the rocks above it, but now they could allow boats to travel through. So they now had have ephemeralized their bridge. They're doing more with less, in this case, less resources. Eventually, some very clever individual realized that rocks might not be the best material for this bridge. And if they replaced the rocks with a cheaper material like wood, and then they used trusses to support it, they could actually have a stronger bridge that could support more weight using less material and cheaper materials, so continuing the ephemeralization of their bridge. As time went on, more smart people thought about this, and they realized that if they turned that arch upside down, they could use even cheaper materials like rope, and they created a suspension bridge. Again, increasing the weight capacity of the bridge, but using cheaper and fewer materials. So it may be hard to imagine what the end result of this is. What is everything with nothing for a bridge? But Buckminster Fuller would, when he would give this talk, would usually conclude by reminding people that the Earth and the Moon are attached to each other with an invisible force, which is nothing effectively, that's gravity. Is it possible that we can use those kinds of things to have a bridge made out of nothing? One example might be when the Apollo 13 mission had its famous incident in the 1970s, it returned to Earth using a gravity assist from the Moon. So as it targeted the Moon, it looped around and slingshotted back to Earth without any materials. It's just the technology that they had on board. So I think the everything with nothing, it's important to use your imagination. Where can we take our technologies? So there are other great examples of ephemeralization. Another classic one is how we watch a movie. We used to have to leave our homes and go to this big building where a massive machine would spin tape and project light onto a huge screen. Eventually, we were able to do that at home with VCR tapes. And then we got even better technology, DVDs, which could have more features. They had special features, and you could skip between chapters, all with a disc. And then today, we don't even need a physical medium. We can watch our movies on Netflix, very often integrated into the TV, better or worse. But we're getting to that point of everything with nothing. So at Heroku, we've done a great deal of work to ephemeralize our own infrastructure, the components that we use to run our platform. When you're running an app on Heroku, it's running inside of a Linux container, and we've actually used Linux containers for about 8 years, so well before Docker was a thing. And at that time, we were building our own components to manage the lifecycle of these containers and to provision them onto the instances that they run on. But as containerization has become more popular, new technologies have come along, like Docker and like Kubernetes, and we've begun to retool our architecture to take advantage of these so that we're doing more and more with less and less, or at least with reusable components that other people, the open source community, is developing for us. Some of that bubbles up to our users, and I think the best example of how Heroku has ephemeralized the user experience is the git push Heroku master command. So when you deploy an application on Heroku, we provision an app for you. We also associate it with a Git repository, and then you can push your code to that Git repository just like you would push it to GitHub. But instead of doing origin master, you do Heroku master. When we receive your code, we detect what kind of app it is, if it's a Java app, a Maven app, a Gradle app, and we build it accordingly. And then in many cases, we know how to run it, because if you, like, for example, if you're using Spring Boot, that's a fairly standard command to start your app. So when our customers run git push Heroku master, what's happening is the ephemeralization of many different things. We're provisioning AWS instances, we're generating certificates so that you can have HTTPS without having to do any work. We're managing the operating system, installing security updates, for the JVM, making sure you have the latest version. We create databases. Again, we manage Git itself. These are all things that you would have to do for yourself if you weren't running git push Heroku master. And certainly even before Heroku and before the cloud, this process was much more cumbersome. Usually the deployment process would start with a piece of paperwork sent to your IT team to ask for new hardware. And then they would install the operating system, and you'd have this one-off process, right? So our goal at Heroku has been to allow you to do more on the cloud with less commands, with less resources. JHipster has done the exact same thing for application development. So when you run the JHipster command, it's the ephemeralization of all these different technologies. Without JHipster, you would have to create your own Spring Boot app, add in the Angular bits and pieces, set up Hazelcast and Liquibase and whatever other components you're using. But JHipster has simplified that for us. It's allowed us to do more with less, doing more both in the sense that we take advantage of bug fixes from the core team, but also that we get to use technologies that we might not otherwise use. The JHipster Heroku command is then the ephemeralization of Heroku and JHipster. So git push Heroku master is great, but the JHipster Heroku Sub Generator actually handles that for you. So when you run JHipster Heroku, it will create the app, provision add-ons, set up some environment variables that JHipster needs to run on Heroku, and then deploy your app in that single command. So I'm going to show you what this looks like, but I have to stop recording. Okay. So how many of you have used start.jhipster.tech? Okay, a few people. So I'm going to go on here and create a new application. So I pre-record my demos. I'm not a Matt Rabel or a Josh Long. I aspire to be those people, but I make too many mistakes. So I pre-record what I want to show. All right, so I'm going to create a new app called JHipster Conf. I'll make it a monolithic app and accept most of the defaults, except for one. I'm going to change to Postgres just because I like Postgres better. How many people like Postgres over MySQL? Yeah, let's talk about changing the default in JHipster later today. Yeah, okay, so then I'm gonna just create that, generate it on GitHub, and it'll create the new repository for me, send it up to GitHub, and then I can go view it. Pretty just standard stuff here, right? So now I'm gonna take that GitHub URL and clone it locally. And then I'll move into that directory and run the JHipster Heroku Sub Generator. And so this will prompt me with a few questions. It'll ask me what name I want for my application, so I'll just take the default JHipster Conf. What region, so I'll do the EU for this. And then what kind of deployment I want. So I can choose between jar deployment, which takes a pre-compiled jar file that I've built locally and then sends it up to Heroku, which runs it. Or I can send Heroku my source code, allow it to run the compilation process, and then generate an artifact on the Heroku servers that it runs. Both perfectly valid choices. I'm going to use the Git deployment for this demonstration. So it will provision, it'll set up my local development tools. It'll provision an app on the Heroku servers. It'll make some modifications to my POM XML and generate some Spring configuration. And then finally it runs git push Heroku master after setting up a few environment variables. So what you're seeing here coming through is the post-receive output from Git. So when you run git push Heroku master, we start a process that initially installs Node.js and npm, runs npm install, and actually I don't think it does that for JHipster, but then it installs Maven and runs Maven clean install, right? And then the first time we run this, it has to download dependencies, so it takes a little bit longer. But then the second time you run it, there's a cache on Heroku, so you don't have to wait quite so long. So it's going to build that, generate an artifact, and then wrap that artifact into what we call a slug, which is very similar to a Docker image that we're going to run inside of our Linux container runtime on Heroku. We call them dynos. Okay, so after that's deployed, I can run Heroku logs --tail to watch the log stream for my app, and I'll see the JHipster banner. Comes out a little funky, but that's it booting up. After a few moments, yeah, we'll see Liquibase running, and then after a few moments, it's bound to a port, and I can run Heroku open, and I'll see my vanilla JHipster app running on Heroku. And there it is using HTTPS. I didn't have to set that up. I get that for free. You can also set up with your own domains, but we give you a Heroku app domain. So all of this, I've deployed a real app running in the cloud, connected to a database, ready to use, and I don't even have to have Maven installed locally to do this. I generated the app, in the cloud effectively from start.jhipster.tech. I pulled down the code so I could run the sub generator, but all it did was change a few things, push it up to Heroku, which then installed Maven and the JDK and everything that was needed to build the app. So that, in a sense, is doing more with less. Eventually, you'll want Maven locally, I assume, but the fact that it's possible, I think, shows where we can take things. All right, so when I ran that JHipster Heroku command, it installed development tools, a CLI that allows you to deploy. It created the Heroku app, created a database, and then finally ran the deployment step. So that's an example of a monolithic app. You can also run JHipster microservices on Heroku. And so quickly I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to start by deploying my JHipster registry. So if you go to the JHipster registry GitHub repo, in the README is this deploy to Heroku button. So this is a button that when you click it will send the source code from GitHub to Heroku directly. So you don't need to pull it down locally. You name your app, we'll call it JHipster Conf Registry. We can choose a region. I meant to change that to EU, but I did not. We're going to add it to a pipeline. A pipeline is a Heroku feature that allows you to do continuous deployment. I'll show you more about that in a second. I'm just going to take most of these defaults. I have to set a password for my registry, so I'll set that to change me. And then the others are just defaults that the deploy to Heroku button has chosen for me, various JVM options and things like that. So when I click deploy, Heroku is going to pull the source code for JHipster registry from GitHub into your Heroku app, and then it's going to run the build process, just as we saw when I was running the JHipster Heroku command locally, but this time it's just entirely running on Heroku. But in effect, it's doing the same thing. It's installing Node and NPM and Maven for the JHipster registry app. Yep. So again, it has to download the dependencies because this is a new app. But in just a few moments, it'll be ready to run. It's fun waiting for Maven, isn't it? Yeah. I think yeah, I mentioned that when it's running on this in this build process, it's effectively running on AWS. So Heroku's platform is a layer on top of AWS servers, but you don't need to be aware of that. You don't need an AWS account or anything like that. That's another example of ephemeralization, the fact that that infrastructure as a service is hidden from you. All right, so that was done. I clicked Open App, and then I can log into my JHipster registry, which is running on Heroku, and there it is, right? So that's the first component of the JHipster microservices architecture. But to make use of it, I actually need a microservice. So I'm going to go back to start.jhipster.tech, and I'm going to create another app, this time a microservice app. So I'll call this JHipster Conf Micro and change it to a microservice application. And then, of course, I want Postgres. I have less problems that way. Okay, so this will generate, again, just as it did before, create the repository on GitHub. And I'm going to go grab that and pull it down locally so that I can run the JHipster Heroku generator on this app. This one deploys a bit quicker because it's a little bit smaller. Okay, so I run JHipster Heroku. It'll prompt me to give it the name of the app again, the region I want to deploy in. I'm going to choose to do Git deployment again so that I don't need to actually run the build process locally. But this time it's going to prompt me for the JHipster registry that this microservice will connect to. So it'll ask me for the name of the Heroku app, and I'll give it that JHipster Conf registry. Oh, it's really low down there. JHipster Conf registry app name that I named when I clicked that deploy to Heroku button, and then the admin password and username. I put change me in that text field, and that's what I'm using here. It'll make some changes to my local POM XML and things like that, commit them to the Git repository just as it did with the monolithic app, and then run the deployment step. So again, installing Node.js, running Maven. You can use Gradle with Heroku. It works pretty much the same way. I don't have a strong preference either way. They should both work equally well. And that's true for both the Git deployment as well as the precompiled jar deployment. All right, so it's building the WAR file. Again, that one ran a lot quicker. It's a smaller application. And when it's finished, we'll run the Heroku logs command again, so we can see this microservice starting up. This time, when it starts up, we'll see everything running, but now we're going to see some Netflix discovery log lines. That's the microservice talking to the JHipster registry on Heroku, and it looks like everything's healthy. So if we head back to the browser, to the registry, we can hit refresh, and we'll see that JHipster microservice connected to the registry. So again, all of that was done. We deployed the registry with a button. We deployed the microservice with start.jhipster.tech, and we don't even actually need the JDK installed locally or Maven installed locally. All of that was done with essentially nothing on our machines other than Git and the JHipster generator. So just if you're not familiar with how the microservices architecture works, my tapestry background only works so far. All of these components, when you're running the microservice architecture, you have a gateway that provides a facade for all of your microservices. Those microservices and the gateway talk to the JHipster registry. All of these components can run on Heroku. The gateway and the registry are essentially JHipster apps. The services may or may not have a database. Those databases, whether they're Postgres or MySQL, they can all run on Heroku. We have free offerings for the app itself as well as for the database. So let's see, how much time do I have? Yeah, I'm going to show one more example before I go back to my slides. When I created the registry, I associated it with a pipeline, and this is a Heroku feature that sort of ephemeralizes the CI/CD process. So I want to show you how I would set this up for that JHipster Conf monolithic app that I created earlier. So from the Heroku dashboard, I can view a sort of overview of my JHipster Conf app. It'll give me, if I have a paid app, it'll show me metrics, including heap, garbage collection statistics, things like that. I don't have to do anything to get that. It just automatically works on Heroku. We can see we can control access to the app, give other users the ability to deploy, things like that. So under this deployment tab, I'm going to add this app to a pipeline. This is a Heroku construct that allows us to move an application through various stages. I'm going to call this the app I already created. I'm going to call my staging app. And when I create the pipeline, I'll have a column for staging and a column for production. So when I deploy to my JHipster Conf app, that's my staging environment. So I can go validate that everything's working. And then when I'm ready, I can deploy to my production app. So I'm going to add a new app to this column. I'll call it JHipster Conf prod. I probably should have called the other one stage and this one just JHipster Conf, but oh well. So I'll create that app. And that's provisioned immediately, and I can run promote to production, so that will take the pre-compiled assets from my JHipster Conf app, including the slug, which is like a Docker image, and promote that into my production app, and that has been deployed. So that was real time. I didn't speed that up or anything. I've deployed my staging app into production just like that. It's up and running. So that's the beginning of that's the CD process, right? We're starting to make it simpler, easier to promote our application through these different stages. But we really want the whole soup to nuts story. We want to come from GitHub and then automatically go all the way through to prod. So you'll see there's a button up here to connect to GitHub, so I can connect my JHipster Conf app to that GitHub repository that I created from start.jhipster.tech. Sorry. So that's what I'm doing it there. I'm just associating those two. And then I'll enable Heroku CI. So we have our own CI product, very similar to what you would use on Travis or Circle. So you get this interface where you can view tests and rerun them and run them in parallel or whatever. And that's all connected to my staging app. So I can configure my staging app so that it will automatically deploy from master when there's new commits, so long as CI passes. All right, so right now there's no test, so it's not going to deploy. So I'm going to go back to my command line and make just a fake commit so I can trigger the CI/CD process. So I'll just call this redeploy and pass the allow empty flag because there's no actual changes. So I push that up to GitHub this time. Instead of pushing it to Heroku, I'm pushing it to GitHub. But Heroku is connected with that GitHub repository, so it'll detect the new deployment. So there's my redeploy commit, and it's building on Heroku. this is very similar to what you would do with any other CI product. The difference is that there is no Heroku, at this time, there is no Heroku CI configuration. Heroku knows this is a JHipster app. It knows that it's a Spring app, and it knows how to test it. So you'll see it running. It's going to set up the JDK and then run Maven clean test, and there's no configuration required. You don't need a .travis YAML or a circle.yaml to make this work. We do have the facilities to add various components, and you can configure those, but for most applications, when you're just getting started, this is all that's necessary. So after a few moments, the tests will run, and they pass. If they don't pass, that's a bug in the JHipster Heroku generator. And then I go back to my pipeline, and I see that now master is green, and without having to click anything or do anything, it starts building the app. So that's what's happening below here. I can click view log, and you'll see, just as when I ran the JHipster Sub Generator, it's running the build process again. This time it's using the cached Maven and Node or NPM assets, so it doesn't have to pull them down again. So after a few moments, that'll complete. Just give it a few seconds here. And that's done. So it's built my new JHipster version. Once I've validated that in staging, I click the promote to production button again, and that promotes those compiled artifacts into my production app. So now that is the soup to nuts story for Heroku pipelines. This could be better though. On Heroku, we are always trying to ephemeralize things, right? So I think the Heroku Sub Generator could create that pipeline for you. All that work that I just showed you of creating the pipeline, creating a new app, we could create both the staging app and the production app. We could associate your Heroku app with GitHub for you. We could enable CI in the auto deployment for you. Those are all things that are on my roadmap, on things I want to do in the future. Those are all examples of ephemeralization. Eventually, we'll add more add-ons. As you saw, Memcached is out. I hope to add Redis as well, just preference for caching. And then eventually, maybe some Heroku in JHipster Online. We'll see. So as you leave this talk, as you leave this conference, I want you to think about ephemeralization, not just in the context of the Heroku Sub Generator or Heroku or even JHipster. You should be thinking of ephemeralization in your own infrastructure, in your own applications, and in the user experience that you give to your customers. Where can you ephemeralize your infrastructure? How can you reuse components that exist in the ecosystem so that you're doing more with less? How can you ephemeralize your own internal application architectures? What components can you reuse from Spring and from Angular that are already out there that you don't have to build yourself? Effectively simplifying the process or allowing you to do more with fewer components. And then finally, what can you provide to your customers that is an ephemeralization of their experience using your tools? I assume at the end of the day, we're all building some kind of technology. And if you're doing technology right, according to Buckminster Fuller, your customers at every stage, at every improvement, they should be doing more and more with less and less. So that's all I have. That is why Heroku loves JHipster. Hopefully you love JHipster too, and maybe one day you'll love Heroku. Thank you.